Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jason Levine, and thank you so much for joining me today on the Friday Video Masterclass, where today we're talking about hardware. And, over the last couple of weeks, we started this new series around Premiere and getting really familiar with all the fundamentals of Premiere and After Effects, and we'll get into Audition later. And we've talked a lot about optimizing your system, and we've talked about settings within Premiere to optimize. But today, I'm really excited to bring on a guest who's going to really talk to you directly about the hardware decisions that you make. Ultimately, at the end of the day, your performance and your comfort and your joy in editing may largely come down to the system you're working on. And fortunately, there's lots of options out there based on, your skill level, how much you want to spend, what you're looking to do, the kind of video you're editing, lots of things to consider. So we have an expert with us today and a friend of mine whom we've brought on the stream before, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. Want to remind everybody that, of course, we are bringing this live to you across YouTube, Behance, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So thank you so much for joining wherever you are watching. Also, an extra special hello to our friends over at No Film School. Wonderful to see you as always. Bring your questions today. If you are following the chats, I, of course, am watching all of the chats live, and I have No Film School's chats in front of me. But you can also ask questions directly here at b.net/Adobe Live. This is where I've got everything right in front of my face. So if you have questions about hardware, about configuration, anything related to that, ask them away. Our friend, our expert, Matt Bach, is here to share that with you. So without further ado, Matt Bach is the senior hardware analyst at Puget Systems. I've had him on before. He's an extremely knowledgeable, super cool guy, and is also rocking a very sweet beard. What is up?
Hey,
Bach,
good morning.
Great to see you today, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Nice to see you. Thank you. Well, the last time we had you on where we were doing sort of side-by-side comparisons and really putting Premiere to the speed test, so to speak, and I made you do all of this live, if you recall. And I say that to our listeners because they know they're watching. I do everything live. There's generally no prep at all. We just go with it. And I forced you into that, and it was amazing because we really got to show kind of the capabilities and really pushing the limits of a lot of the different system configurations that you have. And I know that we'll probably today get to kind of look at that from a different lens. And I know you've prepared some videos and other things to kind of show off the different types of systems and really get into the mindset when you're thinking about maybe purchasing that first, hardware desktop system or whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the problem I've had sometimes with live demos is we tend to push things pretty hard because if you have two different systems and they can both play a clip in real time, well, that's not really telling you the capabilities. So we tend to push things, and when you're really taxing your system and then trying to stream too, sometimes it gets a little flaky. So yeah, I've started just kind of pre-recording things, and there's a lot you can do with pre-recording, especially when you're talking hardware, because I can have a pre-recorded clip from a high-end Threadripper system, and we can compare that to like a mid-range Ryzen or something like that. So right. I'm kind of shifting that way towards pre-recorded, and I don't know. I find it useful sometimes.
I might still put you on the spot. I've already made
absolutely.
Premiere. So
yeah.
just so you know, that's what you've entered into here. You're in the ring now.
No problem.
We're getting a couple. If there's any way, maybe you can turn your audio down just a hair. Getting a couple comments that you are super loud. You sound wonderful to me. But thank you for that, Orland. And hello, Luis and Matt and Patrick and Delio, other friends from StreamYard, Bruce and Henrik, Steve, Rob, Umacorn, Tim, and Eric Addison. What is up? Diordal K, Riel777, we enjoy every day, long time no see. And Eric already is asking on Windows, what's the graphic card you recommend? And I know we're going to get into that.
We'll get into that.
let's get into it. Where to start really? So maybe, and you tell me now, I've got your screen, we can pull it up. You tell me when you're ready.
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Okay. So obviously, as I was saying kind of in the introduction, we've got a lot of new viewers here coming to us from No Film School. And of course, these streams cater to a very wide array of users,
Mm-hmm.
From, just starting in video or completely outside of video, graphic design, but maybe now they're doing video for social, or, if they're a marketing person who's also creating video. I mean, video is just being created everywhere. And as we've discussed, a lot of the time, the reason some people love, if they're not video pros and they have to do video, that experience can be made really great if they're on a system that can really handle what they're trying to do. And, if you've got devices like any of the new phones, of course, where the defaults are, 4K HDR, you're just thinking, oh, I'm shooting video on my phone. I should be able to edit that easily on any system because it's on my phone. But there are things
that's
to
usually
consider.
the worst.
Right. There are things to consider before you start doing that. And that's where I wanted you to kind of start and lead us in.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess just a little bit of background for the people who know, like me. Like, so I work for Puget Systems, and we are first and foremost a workstation manufacturer. And video and post production is probably our biggest like vertical that we target. But my role in Puget, technically, it is a marketing role, but it's to do a lot of like the hardware testing of like, okay, Intel launches new stuff, AMD launches new stuff, Nvidia, and so we look at it and say like, okay, well, what does this actually mean for Premiere? Because oftentimes, a lot of these launches, especially on like the GPU side, someone asked about GPU, so much of that stuff is focused on gaming. Like that's all they talk about is gaming. But man, these cards are horrific for video editing as well. But you've got to like figure it out, And so we do that role. So on our site, if you go to publications, then articles is mostly like what I do. And so that's, again, looking at all that stuff. We have our own homegrown benchmarks that have developed over the years of like, all right, well, here's a good representation of what someone might be doing in like Premiere Pro. And then we actually test it, throw up charts so people hopefully don't spend more money than they need to, because there's always like a return on your investment to a certain point, and then often it tanks or even gets worse. So there's systems out there. Some people will still buy like a dual Xeon. So there's two physical CPUs in the computer, and they're actually just not great anymore. Like they were great 5 years ago. These days, it just doesn't make sense anymore. So we still some people who they'll spend $20,000 and it's worse than like a $3,000 system, just because it's not the right thing.
You bring up a really good point. I didn't want to interrupt you, but talking about sort of if you're coming from the gaming world, the expectation or the requirements. I mean, like I have a teenager, and he's all about gaming, and he recently got a new system, and it's all for him. It's like, oh my god, I can play back X game at 120 FPS or 240 or some fraction. So there's different considerations when you're going into video, and I'm buying a video card. I'm not like, well, what's the highest FPS it can handle? That really doesn't have a lot to do with the performance in Premiere or After Effects, right? So that's a great point, because I think that can often lead consumers who, again, are not sort of researching these kinds of articles. They're thinking, well, if this works for GTA 5 and I can do 240 FPS, this should be great for editing 8K or whatever. Not always the case. They're not necessarily benchmarking the same kind of things.
Yeah, well, and also like the other direction too. There's still a lot of misinformation or just dated. I would guess is probably the more accurate word. Dated information about like the high end stuff, like the workstation class, like the Nvidia Quadro video cards. Right. Like I saw there was a thread on Reddit. I think it was on like the video editing subreddit where someone was talking about video cards, and it was just comment after comment of like, well, Quadros have these optimizations that make them better for like video editing. It's like no, like, that's not true at all. Like there were some things like those Quadro cards only supported or had support for like 10-bit display out, like that was a feature, but they dropped that as a Quadro only thing. It was whatever the last Adobe Max was. What was that? 2019. The last in person. In person,
yes, 2019.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think it was that year, and now like the GeForce cards can do that. So that's no longer a requirement. Like if you need that, you don't have to go up to the Quadros anymore. But it's still parroted over and over and over and over and over because they just don't even realize that it's changed.
Right. So maybe I got to tell you, not surprisingly, we're getting a ton of questions about best video card configurations and RAM. Maybe that's a good place to start.
Sure.
Maybe we can sort of tackle that with some of the systems that you build out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can tell you right now, again, like we are not going to be able to go super deep into this. So if you want to look at charts and graphs and everything, go to our site, go to publications, articles. Nothing's behind a registration wall or anything. But I can talk some generalities is probably the better place to start, and we probably don't even need the screen share for generalities because there are some things, especially with like video cards. There's a few just rules of thumb. One is you're probably going to want an Nvidia card. AMD, they do great for gaming. They're making great progress, but they're still just behind for like post production kind of workflows. It's not their focus, so like it makes sense.
So
Nvidia,
the Ryzen chips, those are again really primarily.
Ryzen's the CPU side.
Oh, right.
Ryzen
Okay, got it.
CPU side, those are actually pretty decent.
Okay.
Intel has. Well, we'll talk about CPUs in a second. Let's stick with
Yes. Okay.
GPUs.
Stick with the GPUs. Okay.
Yeah, so it's mostly you're going to want like an Nvidia card, and the level of the card, most people aren't going to have to go very high. Like you need if you're getting like a latest generation card, it's pretty much almost anything is going to be fine for you. Like they have more than enough like video memory for what most people are going to be doing. And
what is the standard now? Is it like 16 gigs? Because I remember when the 1080i came out, that was an 8 gig card 7-8 years ago. That was like astronomical, right? To have 8 dedicated gigs of video RAM. So what's sort of the standard
8
on the new ones? Is it still 8?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's 8 is anything like mid range and below is going to be in like I think one of them might be 6, but it's going to generally be about 8 gigs, and that's fine. Like you can do 4K editing no problem, and it'll be fine. The higher end cards, you can go all the way up to like 24. If you get the super crazy expensive Quadro, you can go up to 48. For something like Premiere Pro and After Effects, completely unnecessary. Like there's arguments for having like 10 and 11 or 12 gigs if you're doing like 8K, but beyond that, you generally don't have to worry about VRAM too much for like Premiere. The places where you kind of have to think about the video card more, because like I was saying, like you pretty much get anything, you'll be fine, is if you're working with like Red. Red seems to be like one of the biggest areas. Like, you really want to have a nice beefy card. I think B-RAW should be kind of similar, if I'm correct. I know B-RAW is still kind of weird because it's not natively supported in Premiere yet.
Right, we're still with a plugin for that. Yep.
Yeah. But so Red is one of the areas I think that's the most common where someone wants a video higher end card, and that's because it's raw footage, so you got to go through the debayering process to turn it into a usable picture, and that can be done on the GPU, and man, it is really good at it. So the better card you have, the faster that debayering process is, the faster you can play things back.
Makes sense. Now, a bunch of people have already realized that you're talking about Nvidia. Kind of mentioned Windows here. Now, Puget doesn't directly deal with Apple, correct? You're not selling M1 based systems, but I know we've talked about sort of comparisons generally. How would those compare? And like, if you had to sort of sum up someone who's looking at a MacBook Pro, it doesn't have to be the Pro Max, but I think there's only 2 configs really for the MacBook Pro with M1. How that might stack up, or what might an equivalent NVIDIA card be in your sort of experience and testing?
The GPU side is actually probably the hardest comparison to make because like the M1s are terrific. Like I have one back there, and like that's my daily driver as far as like a laptop goes. Yeah. And I think they're absolutely terrific for laptops especially. But GPU, it's kind of tough because the M1s especially, like they do have a lot of, I don't want to call them tricks, but like really good optimizations that make them very good for some things. But like if you're talking just like pure GPU performance, they're quite a ways behind. But also in the case of like something like Premiere, does that really matter? Because if you're talking about just straight GPU, like, okay, if you're putting on all these GPU effects, and that's the bottleneck is all these GPU effects that you're applying, then the M1s are going to fall well behind even like the lowest end like Nvidia card that you can get today. But how many people actually do that? No one. You have to basically artificially make it bad. I think the M1s are terrific, especially for a laptop. If you're looking for like a mobile platform, oh man, they are awesome. They are
right, and that's the key. It's right. I mean, and you're dealing with desktop configuration, so just want to point that out too. That Puget, we're talking about desktops here, and that's why I was saying this. For anyone who's watching, who's kind of thinking about that first big investment, that first big system. Now, if you require, you're going to be sort of mobile, moving around. Looking at laptops, you just heard a kind endorsement there. I have one myself as well. I can also say it's pretty stellar. It's probably the best laptop I've ever worked on.
Yeah, the nice thing with Apple is that they've it's a pro and a con depending on how you look at it. They've reduced a lot of the choice, so it's very rare, especially with like their laptops, that you're going to spend more money and it's not going to be a return on your investment. So that's, again, that part of it is the pro for Apple. The con is you don't have a lot of choice, so you can't really dial straight down into like, I really need this. And that's kind of where we come in on like the high end workstation, PC side. Is, man, you can really dial things into exactly what it is you need. But the downside to that is you very easily can get completely the wrong thing. It's a lot more wild west. Because you can get the wrong CPU, you can get the wrong GPU, you can end up spending, like I was mentioning before, you can spend 20 grand and it's worse than a $3,000 computer. So it's again, that's where we come in from both the someone's buying from us and the education side. Coming onto streams, we do webinars and stuff that are open to the public, just talking about all this because, man, there are so many nuances,
Right.
And sometimes like even on like this kind of stream, I have to talk in generalities. But oftentimes it comes down to, okay, well, what codec are you working with? What resolution? What's your like storage plan? Are you on a NAS? How fast is that NAS? Even like deeper in codecs, like, okay, well, what's the chroma subsampling and the bit depth? Especially if they're talking H.264 or HEVC.
Right.
That stuff is massively important. Yeah.
Yep. And I think that's, again, all of this, and this is why I love that we can kind of nerd out on the details of this and appreciate everyone. This is almost this is more like a talking podcast today. We're going to show some stuff in a moment, but it's a lot of that because you need to know this. And that's the thing is the best machine, and most of my viewers know I don't like superlatives like that, but you can say it generally. The best machine doesn't mean the editing experience is going to be the best because it's not just the machine. There's so many other factors, which you just spelled out. Another thing that's coming up, about 15 questions already, and we can kind of pivot and then we'll get into showing some of those videos. CPU and cores, right? And you kind of mentioned the old dual Xeons. I remember, gosh, now you said 5 years ago. I think I had a dual Xeon like 15 years ago.
Yeah, back when that was the only way you could get like quad
That was the only
core.
way you could. Yeah, exactly. Right. And it was a quad core, right? So how does that factor into sort of when someone's kind of deciding, again, and we're not talking about gaming, we're talking specifically about video, maybe VFX. I see a lot of people saying, oh, I do After Effects. Where do you stand on that, and what's kind of the thinking, some best practices around CPU and cores?
Sure. So I think if you're like in a budget kind of situation, and again, this isn't quite as true with the M1s because they're just kind of different. But if we're talking like Intel, AMD kind of cores, if you can get 8 cores, that is going to be like the biggest like rocketing in terms of like return on your investment. So like generally, as long as you can get up to that 8 core, you're going to be making great strides in performance getting up to that. Once you pass like the 8 core mark, it starts to just be diminishing returns in most workflows. So we still a ton of systems that are 12 core, 24, 32, because at a certain level, at 5-10% performance gain is worth like any cost because
Sure.
If your money or if your time is worth that much money, that's a drop in the bucket. That pays for itself in like a month. So like
absolutely,
whatever.
Absolutely, without question. Again, especially like in the After Effects world or the VFX world, where render time is money, right? And any way that you can help that, you're gonna.
I'm trying to remember if I have a chart. There are some interesting things though once you get above 32 cores. I'm trying to see if I have. Oh, that's the wrong one. It's the wrong article. Sometimes finding in my own articles that I've written, like, oh, which article was it? That's GPU. Well, I'll have to just talk.
Okay, we'll put some links in the chat. We'll have the Puget link in the description afterwards too. Okay, so listen, why don't we see about showing some of those kind of let's show some of those videos that you put together and talk about sort of performance comparison.
One of the things I want to make sure that I talk about a little bit is hardware decoding, because I think that's like critical for so many things, and understanding it, especially for the people that are just getting into like video editing, understanding how massive it is. Let me bring up a post that we have actually. There we go. Okay. So if you don't mind switching to screen.
Sure, here we go.
So this is something that we've put together. This is all documented by Adobe. It's just a lot of it's through like patch notes. So keeping it straight, we were starting to have a little bit of a rough time ourselves. So we just threw it together into a chart. But this is basically all the different flavors of H.264 and H.265 or HEVC. And so you have like 8-bit 420, 8-bit 422, blah, 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 blah down the range. And what we did is we just went through and we just said, okay, well, which one of these have hardware decoding support, which one don't in Premiere, in this latest version. And there's a lot of X's here. A lot of that is not Adobe. So like all of these X's for all of these guys down here, that's because there is no hardware support, period. So like Adobe can't do anything about those. But why I bring this up is because if you have like an H.264 clip and it's 8-bit 422, it's probably going to be absolutely terrible for playback, scrubbing, especially if you want to do like reverse playback. Oh, it's going to be terrible. If it was 8-bit 420, as long as you have one of these things that has support for hardware decoding, it's probably going to be great. And it becomes even more when you get down to like HEVC, because now you have like all these additional flavors of like, okay, yeah, 8-bit 420 is kind of supported by everything. Well, but what if you have 10-bit 422?
Right.
All of these GPUs don't support it. You basically need a Intel CPU that's 11th or 12th gen, and then QuickSync can handle it. And that 10-bit 422 is becoming a lot more popular with cameras, more modern cameras. Sure. Because, you get that extra color depth, you get the extra chroma subsampling, especially if you want to do like green screens. Yeah, it's wildly important. But that's why, as sometimes, you mentioned like, oh yeah, if I record on my phone, it should be fine. This is one of the reasons why that's not always true. Something like your iPhone might record HEVC. I don't even know what format it records in, but it might record in a format that doesn't have hardware decoding support, and that's why it's going to be absolute junk when you bring it into Premiere.
Right. Yeah. In fact, I've been showcasing and talking a lot about using the ProRes 422 footage out of the iPhone 13 Pro Max, and talking about, actually, I think it was last week we were talking about sort of the proxy creation necessities even for that. So, whereas again, as a format, you might have you're going to have better performance than, let's say, yes, if it were HEVC, but you're also dealing with massive media. A 20-second clip off that phone is 2 gigs, in 4K HDR, which again, for comparison's sake, if I go back to my iPhone 10, which is shooting, just basic H.264, it's fractionally smaller. It's also not HDR, so different color space as well. There's so many other considerations there. This is a fantastic chart. I wonder if we have this exact thing on our site. We need this.
I haven't found it. You should though, because man, the hard part is like keeping all this stuff up to date, because Intel launches new stuff constantly, Nvidia launches new stuff constantly, AMD launches new stuff constantly. So like it's kind of annoying to keep it up to date, but we found it highly useful. So I wanted to actually show you one of the things I recorded beforehand was just kind of showing why hardware decoding is so important. So this is a bit of a long video. We'll probably skip around some. So what I did basically in here is I took, this is software decoding up here. This was on a 12900K, so a pretty decent, good CPU these days. So software decoding is with all that hardware decoding off. So this is if you had nothing that supported hardware decoding, which honestly you shouldn't with this format, because any video card pretty much that is within the last 5 years will have support, but it's for reference. Bottom left here, this is with Intel QuickSync. So this is one way you can get hardware decoding with some of these CPUs. And then bottom right is Nvidia. They call it NVDEC. I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it, but it's the Nvidia decoder. Yes.
That's right.
Because I wanted to show kind of the difference between, especially a QuickSync and Nvidia, because there is a little bit of a difference. So the first thing it's doing is just kind of like scrubbing, and hopefully it's not too jittery through the stream. But it's basically just showing like, look, software decoding is kind of not great. Hardware decoding, they're both about the same. And it should speed up here in a second. There we go. So faster kind of scrubbing. Again, it's about the same with either the hardware decoders, but software is just kind of crap. And, especially when you're going through all of your timeline and stuff, you really want that to be nice and snappy, because you want it to be nice and snappy. Just normal playback, 1x, they're all going to be about the same. Software decoding can kind of brute force it through, with the CPU, so it's not that big of a deal. Starting to get up into like 2x playback, we'll probably start seeing a little bit more chop with the software decoding. The hardware decoding, is a lot better. And then the real difference is kind of when you get up into like 4x playback. So you'll notice hardware decoding on the Nvidia card is actually starting to chunk now.
Right.
Whereas QuickSync can still handle it.
Amazing, yeah.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where even though you have support for it from like a hardware decoding level, doesn't mean that it is always going to all be the same. Oh, and yeah, that's a reverse where like software decoding like doesn't even show a frame.
Right. I want to pause on that for a second, man, because again, I really appreciate your candor around this, and by the way, you're getting appreciation as well. Thank you, Linda Lawson appreciates the even-handed answers. These are wonderful workarounds from Neil Cowley. That's just it. I mean, even on a similar or the same configuration, it's just not a guarantee. There's so many factors, and I mean, honestly, hey, we love Intel, but gosh, seeing that QuickSync down, I mean, that's the funny thing is in someone's mind, they're going, oh, well, it's Intel QuickSync. That's the option. That's the answer. That's what I need. That's the best one. I'm doing that. Yes, but I mean, it's not a guarantee. Like you have to take in all this information. You have to look at all these different things. The one thing for sure, and we talked about, and I talked about this in the app itself. I love that you're showing sort of the software decode, particularly in the reverse modes, because a lot of times we'll often tell people, if they're having performance issues around their video cards or errors, go into software or export via software and then, see what happens or how the performance changes and, if you can undo some of the issues you're having. And, software is there really as a backup, right? I mean, ultimately you want to use some kind of, whether it's specifically NVIDIA or on Windows, do we still have OpenCL? I don't have a Windows system in front of me. We have a default GPU acceleration offered to you in Windows if you don't have a native NVIDIA card, I still believe. And of course, on the Macs, you'll have Metal. And on the M1 Max, it's actually grayed out because we're talking natively to that chipset. But again, you have to see these things in front of your own eyes makes such it's so concrete. But again, you have to see different variations of different processes. So you have more. Yeah. So let's see some.
Yeah. So another one I did. So that's an argument for having like a CPU with QuickSync. And the downside to QuickSync is that it's only their consumer chips that have it. So if you got to go higher end, so this example is 5K Red. It's just some of the 5K Red samples that Red puts out. Yeah. That's where like getting a beefier CPU like a Threadripper or Threadripper Pro can make a big improvement, but now you're giving up QuickSync. So right. you still have the Nvidia decoder, but if it's like the HEVC 10-bit 422, well, now you won't have hardware decoding support. And this is often where you have the hardest time figuring out what it is you want to get, because almost everyone is going to work with H264 or HEVC in some amount, whether it's just stock footage or what. But they might also be working with Red. So you have to make that call of like, well, where am I going to give up some performance in order to get better performance here? Right. So this is a slightly different. This is just sticking within AMD, but it's a 5800X, so a very budget, solid CPU if you're on a budget, versus probably the fastest CPU for Premiere Pro, because once you get above the 32 core mark, Windows actually does weird stuff, and generally you're going to get worse performance unless it's like a super really good app for multi-core. But you'll never get that with something that has both mixed GPU and CPU, so you're never going to see that in Premiere.
Is that across the board on NLEs?
Pretty much.
You can speak openly. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, everything we've tested. It's really only going to be if you're like doing like a CPU render. So if you use like 3ds Max or right. Cinema 4D is probably the better. Like Cinema 4D, and you're using their renderer, maybe a higher core count CPU beyond 32 cores can make a difference. It'll make an improvement, but even if you're using like integration between After Effects and Cinema 4D and using the Cinema 4D renderer,
you're not going to see anything. Yeah.
No. So this is kind of doing the exact same thing as the other one, the other video, the trial. So just scrubbing. It's not too bad if you're not scrubbing too fast. The lower core count CPU can kind of keep up. But once you get up into faster scrubbing, let's see, where is it? Oh, nope. I guess I was just showing that like scrubbing can actually be okay. Right. Okay. The playback, you can already see this is just 1x, just normal playback, and the lower core count CPU can do okay in chunks, but then, man, and that's just hitting play. Like, that's nothing special. Yeah. And so that really just kind of shows why, when you need a beefier CPU, something like Red, yeah, you're going to want a beefier CPU. If you're trying to work with like ARI raw, well, if you're going up to 4K, you might not be able to do, native no matter what, but hey, it'll make your proxy generation a whole lot faster.
Right. Something else I want to point out while you're doing this, and this is great, again, we have just talked about this, is now you're doing all this testing and all these examples in full quality. So no fractional playback is happening here. Right.
Yeah.
These are all
these are all full. Yeah.
Again, so here's the thing. Again, for those of you who've been watching and are tuning in, remember Premiere has fractional playback. So in the case of that, the 8-core Ryzen chipset, as you just saw, even the playback at full wasn't spectacular. Now, if you drop that down to half res when you play, I imagine that'll probably be able to keep up against the the Threadripper variety, but you'll have to make that consideration for scrubbing for playback. And sometimes that's the thing you have to do. But again, when you're looking at your investment into the future, this is such a key thing, because I think a lot of people get confused, and I think there's talking about misinformation that Premiere can't even play this, blah, blah, blah. Well, we're stressing it on purpose, trying to display every pixel. That's kind of the point. Now, again, in terms of optimizing your editing experience, and I'm the first to say my main machine is an older iMac. It's a 5-year-old system. It's got a lot of RAM. I think it's an 8. It's also an 8 gig, some flavor of Nvidia in here or something. Oh no, actually, it might be AMD. I don't remember. It's old. I don't often. I mean, on stream I do a lot in full, but really, if I'm doing stuff that has effects and multiple layers and lots of cutaways and maybe bringing in some motion graphics templates, it's a consideration I make. And then the experience gets better. But the point, I think, what I'm trying to say is here. What am I trying to say? Is that depending upon where you are today and the work that you're doing today, thinking about tomorrow, something like that 8-core, which might be significantly more affordable to you, is still a great option. Don't necessarily say, I can't do this. There are other ways to optimize, but you're really seeing everything pushed to the limit here. And that's why I love the way that you've done these, because this is real deal stuff. This is great. And also, I love too, that's why I asked you about other NLEs, because I know you have tests around. Look, we have lots of users who also use Resolve. I saw someone else just mentioning something else about another app for color grading. Obviously, we have integrations with Resolve and with Final Cut and with Avid too. So I love that you're kind of giving these, like, these are the extremes. This is, and every pixel displayed, you're really getting to see how it all works under the hood, and that's wonderful.
Yeah. Because like you're saying, you can always turn down the playback resolution. So if you are you're doing a multicam, you're having transitions and all that stuff, you can always turn it down. And so that's why a lot of our customers, because I will say straight up, we cater mostly to the higher end. I don't care how much it costs, because any return on investment is going to pay for itself in a month. Kind of people. But yeah, you can always turn things down. I mean, any system can edit almost anything if you're willing to use proxies, because even the super old system, any system, as long as you have the enough RAM and video RAM that it can actually process those clips. Yep. A lot of it, especially with media encoder watch folders, you can set it up and just let it run overnight, and then you can come in the next day and you can start editing and using proxies. A high-end system is not a replacement for proxies all the time. We still have lots of people.
YouTube clip. Snap that as a YouTube clip. Proxies, you're still going to be, if you're editing smart, you're still going to want to use proxies. If you're doing 5K red and you're editing, you're not necessarily doing the grading in that moment. I mean, even if you are, but there are so many reasons. There's so many benefits. Do you want to be mildly frustrated or not frustrated? Right? That's how I see proxies. And in the case of using watch folders or even generating those, we'll let you work simultaneously for one, but also you can also just let it happen in the background. A
lot of our customers
time and frustration later on down the line.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of our customers, they come to us and they say I want to work with 8K red natively, and we say okay, we can get you as close as possible, but hey, keep in mind you probably still want to use proxies and everything, because so much of the editing process, you don't need that super high quality, everything exact. You're cutting to talking heads, you're cutting to audio, you don't even need to almost see the video half the time. And so being able to use the proxies, even small things like, hey, your room's not going to get super hot because now this system that's like a 1,000-watt computer because it's got all this crazy high-end hardware. It's not actually, you don't have a literal space heater next to you, with all the noise and the heat associated. So like it just makes even your room more pleasant if you can do that.
Makes total sense. Okay, I'm looking at some of the other questions here. So Rick H was asking, is this with PCIe Gen 3 cards?
This would be I think these are Gen 4. Is what these are, because this is 3080 and I think it's Gen 4, because now we're up to Gen 5 I think Intel has Gen 5. Generally the PCIe speed doesn't make a huge difference. I think the last time we tested was, I think it was even with Gen 3, and we were able to go down to X4 before we started seeing a performance difference in an application like Premiere. So usually for like NLEs, it's not as important. We send systems out all the time where they're actually running at like X8, so half the number of channels to the video card, and it's fine. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Like gaming is where it makes a bigger difference for those kind of things, just because of how it works.
Yeah. It's so interesting that there's such an intersection between gaming and video editing in terms of just what people think are requirements. And it's funny. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess, not that I'm looking so closely at the marketing for these cards, but I guess I definitely see a lot of the marketing. And I guess gaming is obviously bigger than the video editing industry, so it makes sense. But it's interesting that they don't really marry the two in any way. Because they're different, right? It's the requirements for certain types of games are different than the requirements for editing in general. And there's ways on the editing side to optimize and still reap the benefits, whereas maybe they're just, I mean, I'm not a gamer, so there's different things on the other side of that. So it's really fascinating to me, that because I hear this all the time, especially talking about like the 3090 cards and all of that. Someone was just in a thread the other day talking about them, and I don't know how much there are in the US here, $2,000 or something, and I saw all these people kind of chiming
MSRP.
in with MSRP, chiming in with like gaming spec stuff. But I saw a few comments actually from some of our editors who are here right now going, yeah, but for Premiere, for doing blah, that actually doesn't help me. So this is, in fact, this is so valuable.
Yeah, and in fact, we actually just, I think it was Tuesday, they launched the 3090 Ti. Yes. So their new high-end card, that one actually does have an MSRP of $2,000, which means you're not going to be able to get one unless it's like $4,000. And yeah, we just did articles on that. So like in Premiere, I can go ahead and bring up. Yeah. So this is like best case for a higher-end GPU in Premiere Pro. So this is borderline synthetic. Like we just loaded up on GPU-based effects and transitions. So like it's rare that you're only going to be using GPU-based stuff. But hey, best case, and you can see that like, okay, well, this is kind of the spread, like between a low end, the lowest end current generation Nvidia, and the highest end is like a 20%. I want to say that's about. You'll have to check my, in my head math.
Yes.
And 20% when you're talking about like a 24 FPS, timeline, that's only going to be like an FPS. Like, are you going to notice the difference between 24 and 25 FPS? Probably not. So like, it's one of those things where like this is where like the return on investment on video cards is not very high. Usually, people make their decision on which video card to go with not based on the performance, but based on the video memory. So, but again, like we were saying earlier in the stream, like all of these cards have at least 8 gigs.
Yeah. And I'm actually looking where some of the 8 gig cards can still outperform the 12 gig configuration. And that's really interesting.
Yeah. So So for most people, it's not a big deal. I think the most common card we sell is actually the 3070 range, and that's mostly because people say like, well, I'll take that little bit of a performance bump, a little bit of the cost hit, because maybe I want a round trip to Resolve, and in Resolve, video card's more important. Right. Okay, great. And so they just do that almost as like a future-proofing kind of a thing, because hey, you're already spending $5,000 on a high-end workstation. What's another couple hundred?
Right. Okay, so now we're talking about a lot of this sort of in relation to Premiere and the editing side, but I know you also put together some cool videos around After Effects, and specifically because last year we introduced multi-frame rendering, and how that's now yet another consideration when you're looking at putting together a system, particularly if you're doing a lot of work in After Effects.
Yeah, so the cool thing that MFR did, so multi-frame rendering, is it actually brought After Effects more in line with Premiere. So if you have, a budget of, let's go high end, $5,000. It used to be that, okay, well, you spend all that money on like a higher end CPU, a beefier CPU, so you can work with raw footage in Premiere, but it'd actually be worse in After Effects because After Effects was only able to use like one core, and that generally is going to be better on a lower core count CPU. So the nice thing, again, with MFR is now it's brought them in line. So now if you work in Premiere Pro and After Effects, it's pretty much lockstep that like as you go up in budget,
very similar, yeah.
The CPU, yeah. So it's really nice. So yeah, what I put together was a couple of compositions. Both are ones that we include in like our benchmarks. And the top system is just a Ryzen 5800X, the same thing we did before in that Premiere. And then the top Threadripper. So this is pretty much the fastest. I think there might be a Xeon W that's like fractionally faster, but supply on those is so poor that we don't even use them very often.
Yeah.
And so this is just in Premiere. I think this is actually rendering or exporting, but same thing for live playback.
Yeah.
And
sure.
so this is a project that we did zero optimizations for. It's pretty much just like off the shelf what someone might be doing. And in this case, that higher end CPU is only about 20% faster, which that's more important, I think, in After Effects than it is in Premiere. But still, that's not a massive, difference.
Right.
Where it comes more into play is like heavier projects. So general total rule of thumb is not always going to apply. The worse your FPS is, the more MFR is going to improve things. Again, total rule of thumb. You're going to find exceptions everywhere. Sure. But in something like this, this is going to use the CPU a whole lot more. So this is sped up because we didn't want to sit here for a full minute. You can see like this is Task Manager, and you can see how much more often it's using all of those cores. So having 32 cores makes a huge difference. And in this kind of a project, the difference is it's not quite as fast, but it's edging up to it.
Yeah.
And so that just kind of shows why you might want to make that investment if you're having, a lot of issues in After Effects with, performance, because there's not a lot of workarounds you can do in After Effects after a certain point. You can always turn down the, the preview resolution, and all that kind of jazz still, and that, is massive. But oftentimes, especially with the composition profiler, the other thing that they added in After Effects, and the cache frames when idle, that one even more.
Right, yes.
Because anytime you're idle, it's going to start caching all those frames around your playhead. And if you got a beefier CPU like this that can do almost twice as many frames, well, that means that as soon as you hit play, it's going to have twice as many frames already all cached out.
Yeah.
So,
and that, by the way, that feature alone, it's funny I remember when we were putting together Max last year and trying to show that, and it was funny because at the time the system I was using, we film it live. And I'm like, okay, and now with the, some of the new render options, and every time I'd go to show that timeline render, by the time I said, and we have this new feature, and it was admittedly a smaller comp, a more simple comp, but it kicked in so quickly, it starts rendering on both sides, out to the edges. They weren't capturing it fast enough to be able to show what I was even talking about. So we actually decided to use a different machine to kind of slow that process down a little bit.
Slow it down, really.
Yeah. Just hilarious. For the filming. I mean, then we could, do whatever after. But so that you could see it in real time, just that it's, it's happening. And it's the idea that it's continuing to work on the background while you're doing other parts of the design. I love this. In this particular project, which I think I've shown once on stream, super heavy, right? So there's like intentional, very heavy usage of GPU, some non-accelerated GPU effects, and just lots of things happening in there, which is where, again, that composition profiler, which we showed recently on one of the streams, becomes so essential because at any point in that sort of design process, if you're doing preview renders or whatnot, you can see very clearly that one layer with that effect, those series of effects, that's what's kind of slowing this whole thing down momentarily. As you say, you change resolution or disable those effects for the moment. And then when you go into final render, now everything's kind of, it's going to do what you want it to do. Just let's hang here for a second, because I know we're using these systems again. So one other thing that I see quite a few people are asking about is with regard to so we're talking about, obviously, these higher end systems, good GPUs, good CPUs, cores. What about just general RAM and types of RAM? lot of questions
Yeah.
around that. I think now, what are we, DDR5 now?
Yeah, some of the platforms are DDR5. That's still very new, but it actually does give a decent performance bump. I think we saw, I think it was 10 to 15% moving from DDR4 to DDR5, and that's about the same as a bump in like going up a level in like CPU generally. Right. So it is more expensive right now. So it's kind of DDR5 is kind of wonky. I think the biggest recommendations I can give for RAM. Is one, the amount you need is kind of tough to figure out. I believe we say like get at least 64 gigs if at all possible if you're talking about a higher end workflow. I mean, if you're like a student, you can get away with 32, pretty darn easily because you're probably not going to be working with like 4K red or anything. Right. So like 32 gigs if you're a beginner. Go up to 64. We have lots of people who use 128, or for like After Effects, I think we have some people who are using like, oh yeah, I want a terabyte of RAM because they're doing crazy stuff. And I was like, okay, well, sure. Because After Effects will pretty much use as much RAM as you give it. So they just wanted more of those frames already in RAM preview. So there's that side of it. But I think the more important side is, so every CPU now, the memory controller is actually on the CPU. So everything is going between the CPU and the RAM directly. And the CPU can only handle so fast of RAM. Like it has a rating of, it supports DDR4 and then just like a frequency, so like 3600. And it's very, very, very common, especially in gaming machines and a lot of like pre-builts from like gaming focused companies to use faster RAM than the CPU supports. And
that's long
sometimes
been
that can be okay.
Like a thing, right? That's been a thing that people have been doing for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't realize that is overclocking, and that is not always going to work well. And so one of the most important things I'd say for RAM is to make sure that the RAM is actually running within spec for the CPU. Because again, it's very common that people will throw in these crazy high-end RAM, and RAM speed almost makes no difference in like Premiere Pro and After Effects. You think it would in After Effects considering you're in preview and stuff, but it makes very little difference. So it's way better to take that like few percent hit on performance, and hey, now your system won't blue screen as often. So I think that's the most important thing with RAM is staying within spec. I mean, all of our systems always are, and sometimes we get flack for it. Like, oh, why aren't you using this high frequency RAM? It's like, well, because we want our systems to not crash.
Right. Yes. Not overheat and explode. I love also, again, great comment about, they sort of recommend if you're going sort of higher end, 64 gigs of RAM. I mean, it's not so long ago where, 8 to 16, even our own recommendations, I think, on our own site, not so long ago. I mean, I believe it's changed now. Lord, I hope it has. I'm still saying like 8. Anyone who asks me now, certainly if they're just doing 1080, I mean, I'll say at a minimum, just 16. Especially if you're going to be using any other apps with Premiere, right? If it's just Premiere, just 1080p, I mean, I admittedly, I do. I have an older system. It's 16 gigs of RAM. It's an Intel base. I think it's an i9. So, decent. But 16 gigs of RAM. And it's fine. I'm not cutting... Spielberg movies on here. So for quick things, it's fine. Again, when we talk about, and so much of it is that experience, so much of the editing process for many who are new to, longer form or just more detailed editing is just that experience, right? If it's slow, if it's wonky, if it chunks along, if you see that frame indicator going yellow all the time, it's just a frustration that, right? It just sours you entirely. So, way to go for upping those standards because, well, and I'll be frank, it kind of sucks because RAM isn't cheap, but and especially if you're going to be using Premiere and After Effects, and remember we do have that shared RAM architecture. So in terms of focus and what's being used for the in-focus app and what's being leveraged in the background. It behooves you. So let me ask you this. This is my belief in general. Obviously, you want a good video card, and I love all the details you just gave on that. But if you can go with, say, maybe that midline video card and more RAM.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for Premiere and After Effects, yeah. I think the other thing, too, with RAM is, this is temporary storage. Think of it like the countertop in your kitchen. Right. And as, like, CPUs get better, a lot of times people are starting to try to use multiple apps at once. Like, oh, I don't have to close Photoshop. Why would I close Photoshop? Then I'll just leave it up.
Right.
And like they're not doing anything in Photoshop, but it's still there. It's still taking up that
open,
counter
still taking
space.
Yep.
And as
And this
systems
is the
get
way
better,
now.
they can do
this
that.
is the way, right? 15 years ago, I remember actively being on tour. I would do something in Premiere and be like, okay, now we're going to show you After Effects. And I would close Premiere.
Close it.
Or I'd close Photoshop without question. I never, if I'm doing something in the app at some point, it's open. I may forget to even go there, but right, Photoshop is like always open, just waiting. I might send something to it, I might not. That's just how most people work, I think, because the systems can handle it better.
Yeah, and how much more effective can you be as an editor or motion graphics when you can have a dozen Photoshop files up and you don't have to close them? You just send them off to the side and like, oh, I hadn't need to make a tweak. Make a tweak. You're bringing that Photoshop file directly into After Effects, so it just like automatically updates. Like it just makes your entire workflow a lot better. But yeah, you do need to consider like RAM and how much do you need across all of those various applications. I mean, like you said, Adobe, like they share like a pool, and there's a lot of great stuff happening behind the hood, but you still need more. And there's people who have Chrome with 100 Chrome tabs already always open, and like okay, well that's gonna eat up a bunch too. But yeah, I would say that like if I had to like rate like what things you want to look at first, actually like CPU and GPU are down the list. It would be RAM. You need to make sure you have enough RAM first. Second, I would say is actually storage. Like you need to make sure you have enough storage and fast enough storage. Yeah. And then you get down to CPU and then GPU and then, other things. And, there's other things in there like monitor, kind of, I would actually even put, really high up too, because
sure, of course.
If you don't have a good monitor, it's going to be kind of crappy. Your chair.
Right. Oh, yeah. Right. All the other accoutrements, of course, yes. I mean, I'd say probably the chair is maybe just below RAM, if you're going to be doing a lot of editing. All right. So in our last 3 minutes here, and by the way, I see Rick is once again saying Illustrator doesn't fall under the shared RAM. Yes. Thank you, Z by HP. And Mallory Durga saying, this tech conversation speaks to my heart. Wonderful. Love that. You're getting Joe Owens. Matt's commentary is in line with our experiences. You didn't even know you were a prophet, dude. Look at that. Amazing. Last thing we want to talk about was storage drives, drive speed. I just had a question, truly, yesterday on YouTube on one of my older videos, and someone was saying, I watched one of your previous streams. I'm editing. They're editing a mix of red and airy footage. They're going, yeah, everything's great. But I'm finding that, playback is still struggling. I've done all these optimizations, blah, blah, blah. Kind of went back and forth a few times. Come to find out that they're doing all this work in 5K and above on a very optimized system with 7,200 RPM spinning drives.
Yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with those. But
no, they're great. They have their use cases, but yeah, you do need to look at the speed of your drives. And the good thing is SSDs, solid state drives, have come down in price so much.
Yeah.
At least for us, like I don't even know if we put many platter drives into systems anymore. Solid state drives are also more reliable inside of a system. They need to be powered on every couple of years or something like that so they don't start losing data. So there's that side, which makes them not great for like archival.
Right.
But inside of a workstation. They are terrific. We primarily use Samsung drives, and I think we're still at like a 0% failure rate over like 3 years or the last 3 or 4 years. So like they're terrific. That's one of the reasons why every once in a while we get a pitch of like, hey, you should use these drives, and we're like, no, we're good with Samsung. You can't beat like no figures. But yeah, the speed is. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so you actively recommend like SSD for the entire chain if possible.
If possible. And, that's not always possible. If you have a lot of, ARRI raw or raw, sometimes the capacities you need, you're going to have to be looking into like a RAID array of platter drives. Usually those people are already working off like a network attached storage, like a NAS.
A NAS or something. Yep.
Yeah. And there too, you got to worry about it's often just less the drive speed as your network bandwidth.
Your network speed. Yes.
Yeah.
More
and how many people are on it.
Right. And how many you're accessing simultaneously, right?
Yeah, one of the things, I know we only have a few minutes, is just be aware that there is often there's two different units of measurement that different people use. Often when you talk about media, you're talking about in megabits per second. And that's what you're seeing. A lot of times, storage and network. Well, network is usually in gigabit or megabit too, but a lot of storage is in megabytes. And so you got to actually convert that, because sometimes we get like, oh yeah, well I'm using 200 megabit H.264, which is high for H.264.
High, right? Yes.
So I need more than a platter drive.
That out, yeah.
Yeah, I know. Oh, I should be surprised. But so they think like, well, I can't do a platter drive. I need an SSD. When really 200 megabit is like, well, divided by 8, whatever divided by 8 is, it's going to be like 25 or something megabytes per second. So like that's nothing. Right. Like technically a platter could do it. The thing with platter drives is that there's seek time though. It's a physical thing. It's got a physical arm, so it takes a little bit of time, to move around. So that's why even for like those lower bitrate stuff, SSDs can be just so much better. And for most people, move up to an SSD, you don't have to think about storage at all anymore as far as speed. But more and more, we're also moving to the NVMe drives. They look like a little stick of gum usually. Yep. And those things are amazing. I think they're up to 7 gigabit or gigabytes a second. Some of them are even like 14 now are coming out.
I thought it was like 14 was what I'd seen. They're amazing. And also, I know we're almost out of time, but like scratch discs too. SSDs for scratch discs. Absolutely. So valuable, so necessary, truly a game changer. Matt, we are out of time. I want to thank you so much. I want to remind everybody, check out Puget Systems, check out Matt Bach. We're going to have all of his information in the description on YouTube. I want to thank you again for joining us. For everyone watching from No Film School, remember you'll be able to watch all of these replays. And until next time, everyone, have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. We will see you again next time. Matt, thank you so much for being my guest. It's always wonderful to see you.
All right, thank you.
Man. Take care. Bye-bye.